Welcome to It Simply Isn't Done. This is
a special edition podcast. That was really good. This is hopefully, God willing, going to be on General Conference. Sound effects included. Well, let's start.
all right.
So what's General Conference? Yeah.
General Conference is theoretically it is the only body that speaks for the total denomination. It meets with delegates from around the world, elected delegates from each annual conference from around the world, and it meets every 4 years or quadrennia. And it got messed up because everything else did with the wonderful time we had with the global pandemic. It meant people couldn't get here safely. We had difficulties even thinking about doing something electronically because of the number of languages that are involved. So we had a special conference in 2019, right before the pandemic, where there was a general vote that really moved us pretty hard and fast toward a traditional model of United Methodist Church. And what did that mean for us?
So,
I know it was a long time ago.
what did the traditional model mean for us? The traditional model, as was put forth and voted on in General Conference 2019, would have meant that the United Methodist Church would have kept language in that would have prevented clergy from being practicing homosexuals, and would have also said that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, and would have taken our denomination, the United Methodist Church, in a much more conservative direction. Ultimately, what happens, and if we were to back up just a little bit, so General Conference, there's general conferences for several types of churches. I think the LDS Church has one. We're talking about the United Methodist Church here. Chapel Hill is a United Methodist Church.
Contrary to what people often think, the pastors have not tried to make this not a United Methodist Church.
And as Barry said, the way we do things, our polity, our governance, how we make decisions is really based very similarly on the United States government, for better or worse, baby. So that's kind of what we got. And we have all of these levels of voting. So here in this congregation, we affirm folks to go to annual conference, which is Michigan. At annual conference, we vote on people to go to jurisdictional conference and general conference with the entire global body of the church. That meets every 4 years. That's what Barry was referring to. We last met, like he was saying, in 2019, where a more theologically conservative model was put forth and was passed, particularly by the global body, because we're a global church, and there are many places and spaces that are in a different societal and cultural place than we are regarding homosexuality and queerness in general. So it was a pretty close vote, honestly, at that time. And what ended up happening is that it went to our judicial council, and they ultimately found that the traditional plan was not in compliance with our Book of Discipline, kind of what functions like our Constitution. So there were a whole host of reasons why the entire plan was eventually out of order, and we would need to gather again to deal with voting again on what might be brought forth as a way forward for us, knowing we have had this contentious issue for decades.
In the meantime, following 2019, annual conferences met, and annual conference after annual conference kind of did, if not an official vote, kind of took a straw poll on where they were theologically and ideologically around, certainly around matters of sexuality and gender identity, around marriage, around ordination of persons who are other than straight. And coming out of that, the Michigan Annual Conference was far more progressive than the General Church and many, many other annual conferences, particularly those in the east, the west, and in the north of the country, came in more progressive than the 2019 General Conference would have led us to believe. Pause, because we did not have a 2020 General Conference, which would have been the date for an official meeting. So we had 2016, which is the last book of discipline actually we have, which is the publication of all the law that comes out of General Conference. If your head is spinning at this point, do not worry. We'll try to pull it together, but a little bit of history. So 2020 didn't happen. So 2024 is the General Conference that just completed on Friday of last week, and that's what we're going to be talking about. But keep in mind that really the last full meeting that we had was looking like the church was going to be very different than it ended up being once we came out of 2024. The only add in there is that understand that in between, a new church evolved out of the United Methodist Church that began really as a caucus, a conservative caucus group, and then split out through a provision of our Book of Discipline, which allowed churches and allowed other groups within the church to disaffiliate. So if they wanted to not be United Methodist any longer, there are ways to do that. Costly, but ways to do that.
Yeah, and I think it's pertinent for us to know, as Barry was saying, here in Michigan, we had about 16% of churches disaffiliate. So not a huge percentage of churches. Generally, folks were kind of in a place of minimally being moderate, if not theologically progressive, and wanting to stay as this united body. We did lose a few bigger churches. We did lose our Korean-speaking churches, who tend to be more theologically conservative. But there were also a lot of smaller churches that gathered in groups of 12 and 7 and, smaller numbers that ended up disaffiliating as well. So in Michigan, we do feel an impact for sure, but nothing like a lot of our counterparts in the rest of the United States, particularly in the Southeast.
Yeah, and it does tend to be very regional. So in the district of which Chapel Hill is a part, the Greater Southwest District, we really lost quite a few churches, smaller, more conservative, more rural congregations. And part of that is that it's costly to be United Methodist. And if a small church is struggling to make budget, if they don't have to pay apportionments or ministry shares to the conference, that's perceived on the short term to be a savings. So there's ideology, there's theology, and there's economics involved in these decisions. This is probably more than you need to know. So let's go on.
Yeah, well, I think it's, for some folks, you might geek out on this. But let's talk about what happened at this General Conference.
Yeah.
So you'll see it referred to as the postponed 2020 General Conference taking place in 2024. So that's kind of interesting language. It was supposed to be in the Philippines.
It's sort of a matrix thing.
Yeah, it ended up being in Charlotte, North Carolina. Yeah. So we had to kind of switch up the location and last minute. And the first major action that we can talk about is what's called regionalization. So tell us a little bit about that, Barry.
So, and again, it's funny because Jess and I were just laughing a little bit on our way in here because neither one of us were at General Conference, and the amount of data coming out is huge. I will not say that I am an expert on regionalization. Here's what I understand. There is a great desire for the United Methodist Church to be a big umbrella under which lots of ideologies and theologies can live in glad cooperation and be one church together, even as we want to believe and operate in slightly different ways. So the regionalization would allow regional groups to function differently, particularly on matters of sexuality and gender identity, who we will receive as clergy, whether churches will allow same-sex marriages in their buildings and for their pastors to perform those. So those kinds of things will be regional. I am not clear, and maybe you are at this point, how those regions fall. Do they fall specifically to the jurisdiction of the annual conference, or do they go beyond that?
I'm not sure about that either. I've been waiting to find some clarity about this. One reason and one big part of this is that previously, because the United Methodist Church started in the United States, it ends up being incredibly U.S.-centric in a way that is not helpful and is not exactly who we want to be. So we have the annual conferences in the United States, and then we had what are called central conferences, which were just gigantic geographic regions, largely in Africa and the Philippines and some places in Europe and Asia. And they were it was kind of like this separate and apart, like they weren't really fully apart. And if they were, we had bits and pieces of this regionalization before where you were able to have a little autonomy, but it was kind of like you had to do it at the chagrin of being part of the real church and the book of discipline. So this really affirms the central conferences as equal, or at least it gives us disciplinary book of discipline standards of saying, hey, no, we are all part of one church in a way that is much more meaningful and doesn't make our siblings overseas really have to feel like they're not fully a part of what's going on. And it decentralizes the U.S. a bit, which is helpful. A lot of the pieces, like I said, were already in the book of discipline. You can act not exactly in accordance with the book of discipline, but it was hard and it was weird. And like our polity is based on the United States government.
Yeah.
So if you're not in the United States, it might not be contextually appropriate or feel the best for you or make a lot of sense. So being able to affirm that we trust fully our other bits of the global church to kind of figure out ways that make sense for them to live life together, I think that's the overall kind of picture of it as I understand it.
Well, and I think that's right. It was interesting this year, the postponed 2020 General Conference that met in 2024. Coming off of the pandemic, it meant that an awful lot of delegates from outside of the United States had a hard time getting here. They had a hard time dealing with visas. Visas were a lot more difficult to get post-pandemic. So this was a general conference where there was a really heightened understanding of our global church and what it feels like when people who are supposed to be at the table are missing. So it feels like the effort toward regionalization is a way for us to honor one another within this large umbrella, and for us to find ways for different groups to function within that big umbrella without having to think that the polity of the United States is the best thing in the world, because anybody who lives here knows it's got its difficulties, and when the church simply copies that polity, it's problematic.
Yeah. The next, we're gonna lump two major actions together because they are related. Was some removal of restrictive language around LGBTQ persons regarding clergy and actions clergy can perform, and then also our social principles, removing the language that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching.
Yeah, and this all would be helpful to kind of wrap all of this around the first of Wesley's rules, which is do no harm. And we have been doing harm within our language as a church at multiple levels, and it's been going on for a very long time. The church has been trying to change it. Many groups within the church, including Reconciling Ministries Network, of which the Chapel Hill Church is a part. So what came out of General Conference was an amazing move of really a tide of rethinking, and most of this stuff passed on a vote of
Vast majority. I mean,
no, it goes on the
consent calendar.
Yay, language. So which means that it doesn't have to go to the full floor unless 10% of the people want to take it off the floor.
Yeah, so that means 90% of people present were comfortable and were willing to say, yeah, we don't need to debate this on the floor. We are comfortable with everything that this committee work has done to get us here, and we'll say, woo, we're good.
Yeah, we've debated it enough years, and frankly, the people that had the most problem have left or have gotten quiet.
Yes. And so what that ultimately means are we can have queer clergy, pastors can officiate at queer weddings, Yeah, we just theologically don't don't have a specific view. Apparently, only on homosexuality. That's how out of date this book of discipline was. It only talks about homosexuality when our understanding of human sexuality has come so much broader in the time we've been debating it, the decades we've been debating it. I think something really important to note is that no one's going to be forced to do same-sex weddings. No church will be forced to have them within their building. Churches have a little more freedom and autonomy to decide. And I know some of my more moderate colleagues were concerned about that they were going to have to do this. And they do not. Instead, they have to really think, if you're going to do something in opposition or that's not in accordance with where your denomination is going, you have to really put a lot of thought into it, as many of us did when we made the decision to go and be contrary to the Book of Discipline and perform queer weddings, or be comfortable ordaining, standing with those who are queer clergy.
Yeah, when we've talked about it at Chapel Hill through the years, I know that when I came to Chapel Hill and wanted the powers that be at the church, the council at that time, to affirm that we would do at the discretion of the pastor, which right now the pastor has always had the discretion to decide who he or she is going to marry and who they won't. So at the discretion of the pastor, that any marriage could take place in this building, that the church would affirm the pastor doing those weddings. So this really doesn't change that. So
Well, it
doesn't change it anywhere. It says, so before it was you could not do this by church discipline. Now it puts all marriages at the same level and are all done at the discretion of the pastor.
Yes. Yeah, and that, again, in our conference, like Barry mentioned, there was a straw poll, and I think it was like 80%.
Yeah. It was high.
Yeah, like we're fine with this. Like, we don't want to bring clergy up on charges for this. We're comfortable with queer clergy being, like, just generally, like, this is the direction we're moving. So this hasn't been as big of an issue here, but in other places it really was, and was difficult and challenging. I know of a lot of queer weddings that would take place on the steps of churches because folks were afraid if they happened in the church, if the things would happen to the church and they'd get in trouble and all sorts of stuff. So.
Yeah, we did one for a colleague on steps of a little church out in the country, and essentially we had I think there were 25 pastors out there that were willing to be brought up on charges.
Yeah.
For being a part of this, and then it was really fun to try to figure out what the charge was. I mean, if I mouthed the words, does it count, or do I actually have to say them? Was it what's in my heart? So it was really an interesting way for us to say there's something fundamentally wrong with this.
Yeah. And something I think's kind of funny is that our Book of Discipline is so out of date. I think maybe this was the fourth wedding I ever did. It was a queer wedding, but with a trans man. So it was technically within disciplinary allowance. Like, that's how out of date the discipline was. They didn't have any understanding of queer sexuality more broadly because we've been debating it since the 70s. So
yeah, where we used heterosexual marriage language as a way to keep gay people out of the conversation. We were talking about celibacy and singleness and fidelity in marriage was a really sneaky way to get.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, and I think along with this, we've gotten rid of the celibacy and singleness, which I think is interesting. They were that one on the consent calendar, and folks were really comfortable with that, understanding that it was really not because anyone prized celibacy, but wanted to keep gay people out of being able to be clergy. And there's a few other things that kind of go along with that are interesting. So now, if a bishop cannot find a place for a queer pastor to serve, they are allowed to put them on loan to another conference very easily. It made the process a lot easier, so they can go serve in some place that will have a queer clergy person. So there's a few other implications that went along with it that are helpful to make matching people, gifts and graces, identities with congregations where they can do ministry and thrive.
And at the same time, a different matter, but having impact in the same area, we've opened up communion with the Episcopal Church and with the Mennonite denomination. And again, this is every time you do that, it means that we can have communion literally together, but it also means that we honor each other's clergy and are able to swap across lines.
Mm-hmm.
Swap.
Clergy swap.
Clergy swap.
That would be an interesting TV show, like Wife Swap. Jess, you can go to a Southern Baptist congregation and do your best there, sister.
I don't think that's what it means, Jessica.
No. There was a lot of other decisions that were kind of technical in nature. The last one that we thought was worth talking about or mentioning. The other thing of note we thought mentioning, in addition to a lot of other kind of technical decisions or things referred back to committees, is that deacons now have sacramental privileges, meaning they can preside over communion and baptisms. Barry.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So
you are chair of the Board of Ordained Ministry.
I am
my
chair of the
friend.
Board of Ordained Ministry, and our understanding of deacon and elders has changed a lot through the years. When I was a young buck coming into the system, I was actually ordained deacon, and then 4 years later was ordained elder. So it was kind of just a step along the way. We have a permanent deacon now and permanent elder. A permanent elder is such as myself and Jess. We are ordained to ministries of word, sacrament, and order. So preaching, baptism, communion, and the order of the church, including the order of worship. And deacons are trained in the same. They're trained up with a Master's of Divinity degree and are set apart to do ministry in the local church, but more importantly, out in the broader world, and are appointed in the local church as well as out into some space out in the larger community, maybe as chaplains. I learned that Jess has a friend who's a chaplain in a firehouse, which is way cool. I hope there's a Dalmatian involved.
I don't think so. I'll ask her.
That's absolutely
Hey,
important
tell me
for
what's
us
up
to
with
know.
the Dalmatian. Yeah.
Yeah, so we may take this for granted at Chapel Hill, this sacramental privilege, because when Deacon Pat was here, she was doing communion every week, and she did that because we wrote a letter to Bishop Bard and said this is a function that is important for Pat to do every week at the church. Would you please give her sacramental privileges? And he did. And now by discipline, by action of the General Conference, deacons will have that privilege in the churches that the churches of which they're part, as well as in the ministries out in the world.
And what's I think important for us to know about this is sometimes because only folks that are ordained can preside over communion, it might feel kind of exclusive or like we're gatekeeping when communion can happen. What I was taught in my understanding is that is not the intention. It is the exact opposite, really, in that we want folks who are highly trained, such that we understand the importance, the means of grace. We have a lot of humility, and we do not use communion or baptism to harm people, to hurt people, to prevent people from taking it if they don't do X, Y, or Z, right? So we go through a lot of education about presiding over these, and it's one of the kind of highlights for me of what we get to do. It's always the pinnacle of the service for me when we have communion, baptism, of course, as well. And weirdly, in case you're curious, we do communion once a month just because that's the tradition in the Methodist Church, because there was a time where we had circuit riders and they were clergy on horses, and we didn't have enough elders for everyone, so you just get an elder on a horse once a month, and that's when you'd get communion. And for whatever reason, and most Methodist churches, we have kept it that way, and we've just said, well, we're just going to do that once a month, and we do it the first of the month. I've served in other congregations, and I'm sure Barry has as well, where we do it weekly.
Yeah, I concur that we don't do what we do in order to keep people from having communion. Part of what we do is to make sure that it's not trivialized.
Yeah.
We want the language to honor what Jesus was doing in that first meal. Certainly, it has evolved for us what those words mean, and so having somebody who's presiding who's able to do that interpretation well is important. So it's.
Yeah, there have been literal wars fought over the meaning and understanding of communion. So
Yeah, let's not do that.
let's not do that. It's very, we take it really seriously. It's a huge privilege. And that's part of why, we go through the process we do. A calling to be able to ensure it is a meaningful means of grace to the best of our ability.
So lots of other things happen at General Conference. You can feel free to ask us. The Book of Discipline, the special edition, will be coming out for the 2020 done in 2024. It's going to be interesting to see how they title that Book of Discipline. A number of things that I think are important. We approved a budget that is significantly reduced. And what that means is it limits the kinds of ministries we're able to do globally. But there's also a great optimism coming out of General Conference that this denomination is going to build back stronger. That should be a presidential campaign.
Barry for president.
Barry for president.
Barry for president.
Well, it's not exactly what I had planned after leaving here, but it's a possibility.
It is. With God, all things are possible, Barry.
I've heard that.
I think we'll probably catch you up on annual conference after we attend there. And that will probably, for the summer, conclude our special edition polity podcasts. So thanks for listening.